Get ready for this gut-wrenching horror story. This one will make you reconsider your behavior around scary people. A few years ago, when I was in college, I had an apartment to myself. When I graduated, I decided to move since I'd be making enough money to afford a better place and wanted to find something closer to work. Like many people, I had accumulated a lot of stuff while living there, so I decided to sell things before I left. My apartment was on the second floor of a small older building, right next to the school. I posted an ad on Craigslist titled "Moving Sale" and listed the individual items in the body of the ad. I didn't have anything really valuable, just some furniture, books, and my computer monitor, which I wanted to replace with a bigger one now that I could afford it. Messages started coming in right away since it was the end of the school year, and many students were getting ready to move off campus. I set up a constant stream of buyers coming and going from my place. Most of the furniture was sold quickly, and it seemed like everything would be gone in no time. One Saturday, I set aside the whole day to move as much of my unwanted stuff as I could. 5 or 6 different people had come by already, all of which were students. Then I got a message from a guy named Larry. Larry said he was interested in my desk and chair. I didn't give it a second thought and invited him to come over and take a look. We agreed on a time, and when it was close, I went down to the street and waited for him. After waiting for a few minutes, I saw an older van pull up on the street. It was light brown in color, had some noticeable dents, and dark tinted windows. If it was late at night, I would have been seriously creeped out by it. I didn't think it was him at first, but when the van parked, 2 men got out and walked up to me. One of them introduced himself as Larry. They were both older guys, probably in their mid-50s if I had to guess. Larry was thin and of average height with dark black hair that I think was dyed. The other guy was taller and on the heavier side. He was bald and wore a dirty white t-shirt. I felt uneasy but didn't want to be judgmental, so I invited the men to take a look at the desk. I went first, and the 2 men followed me into the building. I unlocked my front door and held it open for them. Once we were inside, I walked over to the desk expecting both men to follow me, but that didn't happen. Only Larry followed me. The bigger man stood next to the door. I looked back at him, and when I did, he looked angry, kind of like a bouncer at a nightclub or something. It was quite intimidating. Nevertheless, I continued to show the desk to Larry. He walked around it, inspecting it for a few seconds, and I stood there awkwardly. The tension was building. Eventually I said, "Well, do you like it?" Larry stopped and gave me a stern look. Then he looked over to his friend by the door. My eyes followed. We both looked at the big man standing there with his arms crossed when he nodded. When I looked back over to Larry, he was holding a large knife and pointing it at me. I panicked at the sight of the knife and tried to run, not realizing that there was nowhere to go. Moments later, the big man grabbed me, pressed my whole body against the wall, and pulled my arms behind my back, holding me there while Larry ransacked my apartment. He took everything of value that I had: my laptop, my phone, my camera. I do photography as a hobby and had a $2,000 camera at the time, and the money from the other items I'd sold that day. After 5 minutes, they let me go and booked it out of there. I sat on my floor, stunned, for a few minutes. Then I got up and knocked on my neighbor's door to call the police. They arrived within a few minutes, and I filed a report. I gave them a description, but it must not have been enough to catch those guys. I never got the license plate number, and obviously the email he used was a throwaway. It was several months before I had a decent night's sleep. The difficult part wasn't losing my stuff, to be honest. I hardly even cared about that. I'd always been a really trusting person before, but with this life-altering experience, it has caused me to reconsider a lot of things, mostly my perspective on people. for this next creepy horror story. Sometimes you leave, and you don't even realize how lucky you were to walk away with your life. I was 23 when this happened. At this point in my life, I was living in Edmonton and had just left a toxic job. I was living out of a hotel because my apartment had water damage from a burst pipe, and we were evacuated. I spent my downtime in hotel rooms searching online for a new position. I was somewhat desperate since I quit my last job before finding a new one. A big mistake. I was at the point where I would basically take anything to get by until I found a job I really wanted. I applied to various positions on Craigslist, including a company's recruiting receptionist, but wasn't having much luck. Finally, I received a call from a man who owned a small engine repair shop. He needed an assistant to help organize the front end and answer phones. It was something I wouldn't normally do. I typically work in healthcare, but as I said, desperate times, and how bad could it be? I agreed to meet him that day at a restaurant for drinks, which I thought was somewhat unusual. When I was getting ready to leave, he texted me saying that we should meet at his shop instead. I thought that would be more appropriate. When I arrived at the shop and walked in the door, I was slightly disgusted. The shop was tiny and absolutely filthy. Papers were strewn all over the floor, and they were covered with dirt. There were food and beer bottles all around. It was in bad shape. I felt uncomfortable and majorly overdressed. I wore a nice business dress with cute heels and simple jewelry. I was greeted by a man whose appearance was very similar to that of his shop. He was wearing a dirty, torn-up shirt, a gold chain, and was covered with tattoos. He had a beer in one hand and reached for my hand with the other to introduce himself. He finished his beer, ran back to the fridge behind the desk, and pulled out 2 more. "Want one?" he asked. I respectfully declined. In the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't a good idea. I know some of you are thinking that was a red flag, but in Alberta, people drink a lot. I'm not saying it's necessarily normal to drink on the job, but in this line of work, it may be more common, so I didn't think much of it. Also, I had been around my share of sketchy people, so it took a lot to make me feel uneasy. It may be fair to say that I was naive, even though I've been through a few things myself. He then started talking about what he would need from me as an assistant. Then, for the rest of our 2-hour interview, he spoke about himself. I'll give you a brief summary of the topics we discussed. He talked about how hungover he was, and all the drugs he did the night before. Then he complained about his girlfriend for a while and told me that he liked my blue eyes. He mentioned that he kind of wanted to hire me but felt I was too stuck up. By this point, I was starting to become aware of the situation I was in. I was feeling very uneasy, not to mention the way he looked at me the whole time was very unnerving as well. I know most people would have left by this point, but I'm painfully polite and hate being rude, even when it's warranted. I made sure to inform him that I was meeting my boyfriend right after the interview. Then he asked to give me a tour of the shop in the back, and that was scary. We were the only ones in there, and this guy was definitely a sketchy dude. He was also at least twice my size. I told him it was getting late and I needed to go, but thanked him for his time. He said he would contact me soon because he may need me as early as next week to begin work. He seemed annoyed that I was leaving, but I had been there for 2 hours, so I booked it out of there. A couple of weeks later, I was still jobless. I was searching online for jobs when I came across an ad with the title, "Ladies, Beware Small Engine Repair Shop Hiring Assistant." I immediately noticed that it was the one I had interviewed for, so I clicked the link. In the post, it mentioned that the man was currently under investigation for inappropriate behavior with 2 women who answered his ad. The article said that they went into his shop and he drugged their drinks. All I could think about was how lucky I was not to drink that beer he offered me. I was contacted by a lady and her daughter who had had a similar experience with that man in the shop. She gave me one of the Edmonton constable's numbers. I did contact them and left a message, but they never got back to me. It turns out that they had been watching that guy for a while, and he still has charges dating back to 1991. I narrowly missed that bullet. Lesson here: always let people know where you are and never take drinks from strangers. Remember, just because the lights are on doesn't mean someone is there. This creepy story began as my son was younger. He went through a growth spurt and outgrew his bicycle. My husband and I only had one child, so everything we bought for him could only be used once. Therefore, it did get pretty costly to buy things only for him to outgrow them within a year, sometimes even less. Because of that, we often used Craigslist to get some of those temporary possessions that would only last for a little while anyway. We used it extensively for baby clothes and accessories when he was really young, so it was a clear choice for a new bike when he grew out of his old one. I spent some time browsing the ads one evening. There were a few nice-looking ones, but they were all overpriced. Some people have the crazy idea that they can sell things for pretty much the original price online. When I buy things used, I pretty much expect to pay half the original price otherwise. What's the point? I kept scrolling and eventually found a red mountain bike that was roughly the right size. It was actually a little too big, but I figured my son could grow into it. The price was right as well. The seller only wanted $100, which was well under half the original price when I looked it up. I sent a message to the seller and got a reply in less than an hour. The seller said her name was Shelley, and we arranged a time to pick up the bike, and she told me the address. The house was in the next town over, and it was about a 45-minute drive for me. I set off when the time came. I went alone, even though I realized that I should have taken my husband. The sun was setting as I drove there. The neighborhood was older, some of the houses had boarded up windows, and the streets were almost empty. It was an eerie feeling because my neighborhood is very vibrant and friendly. The place seemed like a ghost town. When I got to Shelley's house, it looked like many of the other ones on the street. It was in disrepair, but I could see a pickup truck in the driveway. It settled my nerves slightly because I knew someone was there. I parked my car on the street in front of the house and walked up to the front door. I pressed the doorbell, but it didn't seem to work. I tried it again and pressed my ear up to the door. It was definitely broken. Not surprising considering the condition of the place. It was beyond rundown. It looked even worse close up. I was about to leave when suddenly the door opened. An older man stood in the doorway with a friendly smile. He introduced himself as Shelley's husband. He was tall but didn't look intimidating. He had a cane in his right hand, presumably because he had trouble walking. The man told me the bike was out in the shed at the back and he told me to meet him there. I know I sound really naive right now, but the man was really quite charming and I trusted him. I walked around the house and the man was waiting for me in the backyard. We walked together towards the small shed that was on the far end of his property, which was surrounded by a tall wooden fence. When we got close, I saw something move in the shed. Someone was in there. I could see it through the dirty window next to the door. I was panicking inside, but I didn't want to show it. I stopped walking and looked behind me. That's when I saw two more men standing in the yard blocking my path back to my car. I was surrounded. He led me into a trap. My fight or flight kicked in. I chose flight, so I took off running. I didn't even know where to go, but once I reached the fence, I climbed over it and kept running. I soon found myself in the woods. I just kept going and never looked back. After what felt like a really long time, I stopped to catch my breath. Eventually, I made it back to the road and called the police. We went back to the house together, and it's no surprise that the men were gone. I told the police what happened, but the men were never caught, and I later found out that the house was abandoned. I don't even want to think about what those men had planned. The best case scenario was that they were going to rob me, but if that was their plan, then they knew I likely only had the $100 for the bike. It doesn't seem like it would have been worth it, and my gut feeling told me they had more sinister plans. You can't fake a Polaroid. In this mind-blowing true horror story, pictures are worth more than any amount of money because it could mean your life. Let's begin. I live in a large city, but my parents live in a smaller town about 2 hours away from me. My mom retired recently, and she's always been good at keeping busy. She's been using Craigslist to declutter her house from all the junk that my brother and I accumulated over the years. Every now and then she gives me a few bucks for things that she sold that were apparently mine. She's always been very generous. I honestly wouldn't mind if she just kept it all, but it's always a nice surprise whenever it happens. Another thing that she likes to do on Craigslist is trade books. She was a school librarian, so she really likes vintage copies of classic literature. Finding something special or rare online is like a game for her. That's where I come in. Since I was in the city, some of the good deals that she found would be close to me. She'd often ask me to make trades for her, and then I would give them to her whenever we would see each other next. One day I got a call from my mom. She told me that she was talking to someone from Craigslist who had an old copy of The Great Gatsby, one of her favorites. She had agreed to trade for some books that I still had at my place from a previous trade. She set up the meeting just down the street from my apartment. It was no problem for me, so I told her I would get the book and save it for the next time she came to visit. I left my apartment and walked down the street to the corner where she told me to go. When I got close, I saw a young guy standing there holding a small book. That must be him, I thought. He was a younger guy, probably my age, if not a few years younger. He was tall and thin with long hair, looking like he belonged in a heavy metal band or something. Not exactly what I was expecting for someone dealing in vintage books, but who am I to judge? I walked up and introduced myself. We shook hands, and he told me his name was Brett. Then we made the trade. After that, we went our separate ways. I didn't think much of it, and then I went back home. When I walked into my apartment, I threw the book onto my desk and forgot about it for a few days. When the weekend came, I decided to take a look at the book. I had never read it, but I'd seen the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, so I decided to give it a chance. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, and then something fell out. It looked like one of those old Polaroid photographs. I had never seen one in person, I only recognized it from watching old movies. It landed on the ground face down, and when I picked it up, I almost lost my lunch. It was hard to be sure, but it looked like a picture of a dead body. There was a man lying on the floor of what seemed like a hotel or a motel room, and he was covered in blood. I thought it was some kind of sick joke at first. I thought it was a prop for a show or something. Maybe that guy Brett was making a horror movie. That's what I thought at the time anyway. I thought about it for a minute or two, and I decided that I needed to call the police. It's better to report it and find out that it's fake rather than ignore it, and it turns out to be real. I called 911 and told the operator what happened. He seemed to take it seriously and sent an officer to me. I went to the station and filed a report. We got my mom on the phone to see if she could track down Brett. She had only communicated with him through email, and he wasn't replying. The officers were not able to tell for sure if the picture was real, but they promised to do more analysis on it. It's been just over 2 months. and I still haven't heard anything back from the police. I still don't know if the picture was real. This was one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. Was I just face to face with a murderer? If so, why would he put that picture in there? An accident, maybe? Or maybe he was toying with me like it was some kind of sick game to show someone what he had done. This terrifying tale all begins when independence looks so good, but reality bites much harder. My name is Maya. I'm 25 years old living in the city with my boyfriend Kevin. Honestly, things have been tough lately. Kevin lost his job a few months ago, and money has been really tight. We had been staying with my parents for a while to get back on our feet, but you know how it is living with parents as an adult. It just starts to weigh on you after a while. You feel like you've lost your independence. Kevin was going stir-crazy just sitting around the house all day. Actually, we both were. So when we saw this suspiciously cheap apartment listing on Craigslist, it seemed too good to be true. But Kevin was desperate to get us out of my parents' place. I'll admit, I kind of love the idea of having our own little nest again, a fresh start. Despite the little voice of doubt in the back of my mind, we took it. In hindsight, I should have listened to that voice. It all started out pretty mundane and normal at first. The apartment was nothing fancy, just a basic one-bedroom in an older building on the rougher side of town, but it was clean. The landlord seemed nice enough. And hey, we could actually afford it. Those first few days we were just relieved to be out on our own again. We went to the grocery store, cooked dinners together, and binge-watched some shows on Netflix in the evenings. All that simple blessing of normalcy we had been craving finally came to fruition. Then the petty disagreements about leaving dishes in the sink, or whose turn it was to take out the trash, began. I missed those silly arguments when things started to go wrong. But then all the hair-raising events began around the fourth or fifth night. I woke up sometime after 11 p.m. to use the bathroom. As I was coming out, I heard the most terrifying sound of a woman screaming. No, screaming doesn't even describe it properly. It was this blood-curdling, ripping shriek of pure fear and agony. It made my blood run cold. I shook Kevin awake in a panic. "Did you hear that? Someone's in trouble? We have to call the police," I said. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a TV or something from another apartment. But I knew what I heard. It wasn't normal. Right then there was frantic knocking at our door, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Kevin motioned for me to stay back as he carefully went over and opened it a crack. It was our landlord, Mr. Carl. He had this disturbingly casual smile on his face as he said, "No need for alarm, folks. Just a little disagreement between a couple of tenants. But it's being taken care of, so no need to call the authorities, okay?" The way he said it with such a total lack of concern was so bizarrely off-putting, almost like he was amused by the whole thing. I shivered despite the warm night. "If you're sure, mister." "Carl," Kevin said uneasily. "We'd still hate to be a bother. Can we call if anything else comes up?" "Oh, there's no bother at all. But please, if you do happen to see or hear anything unsettling, don't go calling the cops, please. That never ends well for anyone, mister." Carl chuckled as if he just told a hilarious joke. "You two seem like such a nice, smart young couple. Why don't you just give me a ring directly if any future unpleasantness arises?" "I'll get it sorted out." He gave an overconfident wink, then without another word turned and headed back down the dingy hallway whistling some eerily cheery tune. The look Kevin and I exchanged in the wake of that supremely unsettling encounter said it all. We both knew deep down that something was deeply wrong here with Kozak, with this whole place. But what choice did we have? We were broke and hadn't even unpacked all our things yet, so we tried our best to just ignore it. Chalk it up to the landlord being some eccentric old man and hope things didn't get any weirder. Oh, how I wish I could go back to the naive mindset of those first few nights, unburdened by the sickening realizations that were still to come. It started with the small things at first, like hearing strange noises in the night. Not just screams this time, but occasional muffled thumps and the sounds of people frantically running up and down the halls, always at the most unholy hours between midnight and 4 a.m. Whenever I brought it up to Kevin, he got this glazed, half-asleep look in his eyes and denied hearing anything out of the ordinary. Part of me wondered if he was just trying to reassure me to cling to some sense of normalcy in our new home. Another part of me knew he heard those noises too, and was just as terrified as I was. Then more bizarre events started occurring. Strangers would randomly knock at our door at all hours, just dazed-looking men reeking of booze or worse. Me, Carl said it would be okay, this is where I'm supposed to go. We stuck to the cardinal rule of never opening the door to those sketchy individuals. But the implications of what they were showing up for made my blood run cold. Kevin and I didn't even want to voice our darkest suspicions out loud. Despite the escalating weirdness, we both felt so trapped. Neither of us had jobs at that point, and we had blown what little savings we had on the move and security deposit. Where the hell else could we go? Then came the night that fully shattered any remaining illusions. The night that pushed us past the breaking point. I woke up around 2 a.m. to Kevin tossing and turning, mumbling incoherently in his sleep. I tried to gently shake him awake, growing more frantic as he wouldn't wake up. Finally, his eyes flashed open, wild and unfocused. He looked right through me with zero recognition. "Kevin, babe, what's wrong? You were having a nightmare." That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a young woman crying, sobbing in pure, hopeless despair. It seemed to be coming from the apartment next door. My heart stopped as I realized whatever nightmare had been plaguing Kevin, he likely heard those cries too. We had the same horrific implications about what they meant. I wanted so badly to run out of there, pound on that door, but I'd seen enough crime documentaries to know that's exactly how young women end up dead. So we just sat there petrified, listening to those tormented wails that went on forever. Eventually they trailed off into a deathly silence, even more chilling. I knew deep down we couldn't spend another night in this waking nightmare. Not after that. The next morning we packed up as quickly and quietly as humanly possible. I didn't even care about getting the security deposit back at that point. Nothing was worth sticking around that hellhole a second longer. As we were dragging our meager belongings out to the cab, Mr. Carl emerged from the shadows and flashed that same sickening grin. "Leaving so soon?" "I do hope every accommodation was to your liking during your stay," he said, letting out this wheezy chuckle that made my skin crawl. Kevin urged me past without a word or eye contact. We never looked back. So there you have it. We got out, but so many mysteries remain. Just what kind of unspeakable depravities were happening behind those paper-thin walls? Who were those poor souls we heard screaming and crying out so desperately? And most of all, what did Mr. Carl mean by accommodation? Was he implying we were somehow complicit by our silence? By witnessing those horrors and doing nothing? I try not to dwell on it, but those questions still haunt me. If only we'd had the resources to go somewhere else right away. If only we'd found the courage to report Kozak no matter how ominous his warnings. If only in the end, I suppose we'll never know the full truth. But one thing's for certain from now on. We're never taking too good to be true apartment listings on Craigslist ever again. Some horrors are better left undiscovered. Did I just acquire the creepiest roommate ever? This story is a written documentary of my friend's last words before he unexpectedly disappeared. A few months back, I finally moved out of my parents' place. I didn't have a lot of money saved up, so I could only get a place in the sketchy part of town. But fortunately, the building my apartment was in seemed like the safest place in that part of town I had to move to. I absolutely refused to go back to my parents. Everything was fine, except the rent was pretty high for my budget. So in order to offset the costs of living, I decided to put out an ad for a roommate on all the places I could think of, and finally got a hit on Craigslist. Now that I think of it, that right there should have been red flag number 1. So I found a roommate. His name was Jackson, and he seemed like an alright dude. There was, however, about 2 years of age difference between us, him being 25 and me being 23. I know I should have moved out a long time ago, but that's another story. Everything was okay for a few months. He had a job that kept him busy, and we would hardly see each other during the week. Anyways, he seemed to have most weekends off, so according to him it was a decent job. At least he never complained about it. So on the weekends we would go and get something to eat, hang out at places, or just eat at home. This is where my problem started with him. For some unknown reason, he never picked up after himself, which got on my nerves after a while. He'd leave his trash by the front door, never taking it out. It became so bad that it sometimes got to the point that whatever was in the bag would start to rot and smell the apartment up like a pig pen. I really don't know why I never just picked the bags up myself. I suppose it is just the principle of things. Now that I think about it, I should have checked what was in the bags, because that smell wasn't normal at all. He'd leave his dishes in the sink, and whenever I washed them, the water would turn a murky brown color. These were all only knives and sharp objects. Why didn't I notice that before? Anyways, I got to a point where I just refused to wash them because it was just disgusting, and he should be able to clean up after himself. Whenever I brought it up to him, He'd get angry and storm into his room, muttering something about getting caught by the police. I just brushed it off like he was crazy, which is probably true. In hindsight, this made me afraid to bring it up to him. I was still fine with him being in the apartment as he was on the lease with me. I didn't really have a choice but to be okay with it, because financially I don't know if I could make it alone. Another one of his weird things, he never wanted to watch the news. If we were watching TV and the news came on, he would either turn the TV off or change the channel when I wasn't around. Maybe he's got PTSD, and that stuff might trigger him. I don't know. It definitely doesn't sit right with me, though maybe I'm overreacting. I'm not really sure what to make of this situation. When we go out in public, he's always wearing a mask and sunglasses, as if he's afraid to be seen. He never wants to go to places with a lot of people. He would rather stay at home. I'm a homebody to an extent, but even I like to go out. Sometimes I really don't get it. I started assessing the situation, and it sucks I got this kind of roommate, but maybe it's worse than that. Maybe he's like a murderer or something. I doubt that's the case. I would think I could see the signs. Maybe he is. I mean, it all lines up. I'm probably just overreacting though, right? Yeah, I'm overreacting. I just can't get over the thought. I don't know what to do. Another thing that's weird, he spends hours in the basement of the apartment complex. I've asked the owner of the building if he's okay with this, and he seemed to have no problem at all. He seemed nervous when I asked though. He said that he heard some commotion in the alleyway by the apartment, and when he went to check it out, he saw my roommate hurting someone. He said he got away without my roommate seeing him, but he's still scared that my roommate might have possibly seen him. Jackson, my roommate, had asked my landlord for the keys to the basement. Not wanting to get hurt, he gave them to him. I want to investigate, but I don't want to risk it. What if I get caught? Or what if, because of my paranoia, an innocent person dies in the basement? I would rather just not attempt it. I don't know what to do. I'm scared that he'll find out I'm following his moves. I wish I could just kick him out, but the manager of the apartment seems scared of him, and by what he said, for good reason, I think I should be too. I just don't know what to do. I'm afraid that he's done something bad and is going to do something bad again. Should I go to the police about this? What if they find something? Or worse, they don't. And I'm just crazy and the one that falsely accused his roommate of murder. What happens then? I've been watching the news closely for a story about a murderer or a missing person, but nothing. I think I'm going to confront him. If I don't give you an update, I'm dead. I really hope I'm just paranoid. Oh God, he's here. He's unlocking the door to the apartment. I have to go. These may well be my last words. If they are, I love you, Mom. I'm sorry I was such a bad son. I love you. Goodbye. Hopefully not forever. After listening to this creepy Craigslist tale, it will give any young lady chills down their spine. A few months ago, I was bored at work one day. When I didn't have as much to do, I would just go on my phone or browse the internet on my computer. Sometimes I go on Craigslist and look at cars or other things for sale just for fun. One day I had about an hour until I got off work and everything was slow. I went on Craigslist and then noticed the misconnection section. I clicked on it just for fun, because I thought it might be amusing to read. This is a section on Craigslist where people will post about if they saw somebody and maybe had a conversation with them in public or something. If they didn't get the person's name or any information, they'll reach out and ask them to contact them. That's why it's called misconnections. And it seemed kind of weird to me. I clicked on a few and read them. On the fourth, or maybe the fifth one that I saw, it seemed like the person was writing about me. The ad said blonde female in and then mentioned the name of the city that I live and work in. When I clicked on the ad, it said, I saw you walking on your street last Thursday night. Saw you again at Target the next day wearing a Braves hat. Let me know if I can come over sometime. This really shocked me because not only had I gone for a walk in my neighborhood Thursday night, but I had been at the Target as well, and I was wearing a Braves hat at Target. It made me a little bit suspicious. The fact that the person had seen me in two different places made me wonder if they were stalking me. That's what was going through my head immediately. But maybe it was just somebody who lived in my neighborhood, and it was a coincidence. They were definitely describing me, I knew that for a fact. But I decided not to answer the ID. I finished work for the day and then went home. I lived by myself in a smaller house on a fairly busy street. One of my best friends, Avery, came over after work. We would hang out quite a bit. After she came over, I told her about the Craigslist post. I decided to show it to her. so I got my laptop and logged on. When I got to the misconnections part of Craigslist, I saw that there was now a new posting. The title said, "Blonde Woman In," and then mentioned my city again, part 2. I clicked on it and read the advertisement. It said, "You didn't respond to my first ad. I guess you didn't see it. Blonde girl walking your street Thursday night. Braves hat on and Target Friday. Let me know if I can come over. You live on my street and in a big house with your blue Toyota in the driveway." I could feel my heart rate increasing, and I suddenly felt really nervous and scared. It was now obvious that whoever this person was, they knew where I lived, and I must have seen them at least twice, and maybe not realized it. It didn't seem like a coincidence. I then got scared that maybe somebody was watching my house, and I asked Avery to check outside to see if there was anybody there. She got up and walked out to the living room and looked outside from a window but didn't see anyone. She then asked me if I knew any creepy guys or if there was anyone who might want to do this to me. I told her no, and we both thought it was probably best that I called the police. I then picked up my phone and dialed 911. When I told the police about it, they said that they would send over an officer to my house to check on things. I waited, and eventually the officer showed up. I showed him the ad and told them everything that had happened. I asked him if he would look around my house outside because I was too scared to do it myself. He agreed and went outside. While he was gone, Avery and I waited in the kitchen and talked about the whole situation. After a couple of minutes, we heard a noise from the side of the house. It was something tapping the side of the house. And it was from the side where we didn't have any windows. I looked over at Avery and we were both scared. I walked into the living room to see if I could look out the front window, but before I could get there, I heard a loud bang on the front door. I froze in my tracks and then turned back to Avery. She told me to just wait because the police officer would be back soon. As she was talking, I saw him walk back in from the other side of the house. The officer walked to the front door and opened it quickly. I could see that he looked around but didn't see anybody. After this, he came back inside and told me that he saw nobody around. He then told us that he would stay close by in the area for a while, and suggested I stay inside with the doors locked. It was good to have the police there, but after they left, I was still really scared. I stayed with Avery for the rest of the night, and we were both on edge. I had to work the next morning, and when I got to work, I checked Craigslist again. I saw yet another posting, this time saying "Blonde woman at home." Third time's the charm. I felt like it was only getting worse. And whoever this person was, they were not going to stop. I tried to keep myself together and think of what to do next. I didn't respond to any of the posts. And after work, I was pretty much planning on going straight to the police station to talk to them in person. I was scared that somebody might be following me. I made it through the day and did my best to act normally. When I got back home, Avery had actually stopped by already and was waiting for me inside. She offered to drive me to the police station, and I was glad to have her around. We then left and went straight to the police station. I met with an officer, and they took my report. I showed them the ads and explained everything that had happened. They told me that they would do everything they could to find the person responsible and help keep me safe. I then drove back home and hoped that things would get better. I kept checking Craigslist for any new posts, and the good news is that I didn't see any new ones. After the police took my report, nothing more seemed to happen. Maybe they were able to find the person or scared them off, but I'm not sure. I never got any answers or heard anything from the police about it. I still sometimes wonder who it was and what they were trying to do. What would you do if you found a hidden compartment in your new car filled with chilling secrets that suggest the previous owner was a hideous monster? Well, get ready, because we are about to dive into this terrifying tale. I'm Martin, but some folks call me Hope. I'm 34 and a software developer living in Seattle. Recently, I've been going through a tough time. My girlfriend Jen and I broke up 6 months ago after being together for 5 years. It was messy, and I'm still not over it. I decided to move and get a fresh start, which included selling my car because it held too many memories of Jen and me. I found a decent deal on Craigslist for a 2015 Honda Civic. I decided to pursue it, but I had no idea that buying this car would turn my life into a living nightmare. When I met the seller to check out the car, everything seemed normal. The seller Bill was a middle-aged guy who was very friendly. He said he was upgrading to a newer model. The car looked good, no major dents or scratches. I then took it for a test drive and everything seemed fine. We finalized the paperwork for $8,500 and I drove my new Civic back to my apartment. I was super pumped. A few days later, I decided to clean the interior. That's when I made a disturbing discovery. Underneath the backseat cushions, I found a hidden compartment. It was a small door carved into the trunk area, leading to a tiny, enclosed space between the rear seats and the trunk. I couldn't understand why a regular car would have something like this, unless it was for a more sinister purpose. When I looked inside the cramped compartment, I felt sick. It smelled of stale sweat and possibly something even more disturbing. Shining my phone's light inside, I saw streaks of dried brown liquid that looked like blood. Feeling nauseous, I quickly closed the compartment and stepped back overwhelmed with dread. What terrible things had the previous owner done with this vehicle? Had he used the secret room to transport victims he had harmed or killed? The questions swirled in my mind, each more horrifying than the last. I realized I was now connected to something deeply disturbing and possibly criminal. Part of me wanted to go straight to the authorities to report my finding and put as much distance as possible between me and whatever depravity this vehicle had witnessed. But another part of me, influenced by crime shows and horror movies, worried that coming forward might make me a person of interest, even a suspect. So I did nothing for the time being. I tried my best to go about my daily life and not think about the ominous secret compartment. But how could I not? Every time I opened the trunk or slid into the driver's seat, I was assaulted by phantom smells and visions of unimaginable horrors. The subtle stain of dread resurfaced, leaving me uneasy and tormented by morbid hypothetical, restless nights which were punctuated by vivid nightmares, visions of being trapped in that cramped, sweaty compartment, banging hopelessly on the door, gulping stale air as my cries for help went unanswered. Other times I dreamt I was Bill, a mild-mannered monster calmly shuttling my unspeakable cargo to its grim destination. Awake, I began noticing small details about the vehicle that had previously escaped me. A splotch of reddish-brown discoloration in the trunk lining, strange symbols etched into the underside of the dashboard, and the faint acrid scent of chemicals lingering in the cabin's recirculated air. Each observation fed the cycle of dread and fueled my imagination to even darker places. After a week of inner torment, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I would remove the wretched compartment, scrub the vehicle clean of any lingering remnants of its prior purpose, and be done with it once and for all. Armed with a toolkit and a bucket of industrial cleaner, I set about dismantling the hidden room. As I carefully pried away its flimsy wooden panels, I knew my plan was doomed to fail. Tucked amid the sickly beige upholstery was a small cardboard box. Its contents promised to further unravel what remained of my sanity. Inside, I found handwritten notes scrawled in what seemed to be chicken scratch. Pages and pages of rambling, half-coherent screeds vacillated between records of apparent daily minutiae and grandiose proclamations about bearing witness to an ethical truth. Certain chilling phrases leapt off the page. They're everywhere, hiding in plain sight, horrible, unblinking eyes peering through the veil at all times. Can't let them steal my essence, not after coming this far. Another page decorated with strange symbols reminiscent of those on the dashboard. Where at the time of transformation draws near, the offering prepares the vessel to shrug off its withered husk and be remade anew, incorruptible and eternal. As I read on slack-jawed in disbelief, it became clear these were no ordinary unhinged ramblings. Something larger and far more insidious bound them together. As I sit here clutching those cryptic pages, part of me wants nothing more than to shove them back into the shadows and return to blissful ignorance. To move on from this existential detour and find some semblance of normalcy again, pushing bile-inducing questions of cosmic dread from my mind. But another part, call it sickening curiosity or a deficit of self-preservation, feels inextricably drawn to unraveling this disturbing saga, even if the truth is too horrific to behold. For now, the mysterious compartment sits reopened in the car, almost daring me to keep pulling its sickening threads. While part of me craves a return to blissful ignorance, another part can't resist the lure of the unknown. Get under your covers for this next frightening horror story, because this one is beyond creepy. This story took place back in the summer of 2021. During that time, I just recently got a brand new car. Before that, I had been driving an old 2004 Chevy Trailblazer, which, if you don't know, is an SUV. I didn't think it would be worth much, but I still decided to sell it on Craigslist. After all, that's where I had bought it years earlier, and I had taken really good care of it for the most part. I took some pictures out of my driveway and then listed the car. It ran pretty well and was very reliable, so I knew somebody would be interested. I listed it for $2,000 and waited. I wasn't in a rush to sell it, and it took about 2 days before I got the first response to the AD. The response was from someone asking if the car was still for sale. I said yes, and they texted back, asking if they could take a look at it. We then arranged a meeting after the person got off work the following day. I asked for their name, and he said his name was Barry. He said that he got off work at 8 p.m. I suggested that we meet in the parking lot of a nearby grocery store, because there was a really big parking lot. It would also be in a public area, because I didn't want a random person showing up at my house. Barry agreed, and the next day I drove out to the store, which was like 5 minutes away from my house. I got there early and looked around the parking lot. I told him that I was in the very back corner and you really couldn't miss me. The parking lot was always empty in the back half or so. It was often used for truckers or sometimes even fifth-wheel campers to park overnight. The first red flag happened before Barry even showed up was, he texted me, saying that he was there and asking what my car looked like. I thought, seriously, you're the one interested in buying the car, and you don't even remember what it looks like. I gave him a description, gray SUV in the back corner. He then replied, saying that he saw me and was driving over. I looked around and watched a much newer-looking car approach me. It looked to be a red Ford Focus that was only a few years old. He parked right next to me, and I watched a man get out. He was younger, looking maybe 30 with dark brown hair and black glasses. I got out of my car and walked over to him. We met out front of my car and shook hands. I told him some basic information about the car as he looked at it. Less than a minute in, he asked me if we could go for a test drive. I said yes, and Barry got into the driver's seat of my car, and I got into the passenger seat. I noticed that he was on his phone a lot in the short time since he had gotten out of his car. Something just seemed a little bit strange about this guy. When he started driving, I asked him if he knew this area and if he could drive on some roads close by. He said that he knew it well, and we left the grocery store and headed to a quieter area. Barry went down a road that I had only been on a couple of times. It was a somewhat quiet road with a speed limit of 35. There were some patches of woods here and there, and some buildings that seemed to be industrial. During the drive, things were pretty quiet. I talked about the car for the first couple of minutes, but Barry didn't really respond or say anything back to me. I remember him looking at his phone once while driving, and I told him that he shouldn't do that. He was like, "Oh, sorry." And then he put it away. I asked him how he thought the car was driving and if he liked it. He just said, yes, it was good. After maybe 5 minutes of driving, I was starting to think that we should head back. That's when Barry suddenly began slowing down. He then pulled off the road and into this really crappy-looking abandoned parking lot. There were all kinds of woods on both sides leading into it, and the parking lot had tons of potholes and looked to be for a warehouse. When he got into the parking lot, he drove in a little ways and then stopped the car. I noticed that there was one other car in this parking lot. I thought at first maybe Barry just wanted to turn around in there, but when he stopped the car, I was really confused. Barry then shut off the engine and took the key out of the ignition. Then he opened up his driver's door and started to get out. I was really confused and just watching him, wondering what was going on as he was getting out. He then suddenly yelled at me to get out of the car. I looked to my right and saw 3 men getting out of the other vehicle that was also in the parking lot, and the 3 men were walking towards us. They were maybe 50 feet away. These men started walking at a fast pace, and Barry stepped out in front of my car and then waved at me to get out. I heard him yell at me to get out of the car again. I knew that I was in trouble at that point, and I didn't know what these guys wanted, but I realized something quickly. My car had 2 keys for it, and I had brought the spare just in case I would have sold it that night. It was in my pocket. After Barry saw that I was not getting out of the car, he started walking over to my passenger's door. I figured that he was going to try to force me out. Meanwhile, the other 3 men were now only about 20 feet away. I reached in my pocket and felt for the lock button for the doors. I pushed it, and when Barry got closer, I moved over into the driver's seat of the car. He reached the door and tried opening it, but it was locked. In that moment, I quickly put my spare key into the ignition and started the engine. Barry had the other key still and would be able to unlock it if he got it. When the car started, I saw him reaching into his pocket and saw the other men start running. As soon as the car was started up, though, I put it in drive and slammed my foot on the gas. The car jerked away from everyone, and they gave chase on foot for a short time before I sped away. I then made a quick U-turn as the men were now running for their vehicle. I drove out of that pothole-filled parking lot as fast as I could, and then back onto the road. I took the very first turn that I saw from that road, and the men were not able to reach me in their car on time. I didn't see them behind me and was able to get away. I went straight back to my house, and when I made it back home, I called the police and reported the whole thing. I told them about the car at the grocery store that Barry had left and gave as much information as I could. I later found out that the car Barry used to get to the store parking lot was still there and came back as stolen. I'm not sure if Barry and those other guys were ever found, I know that. I'm just really glad that I had the spare key with me and was able to get away from them, otherwise who knows what could have happened to me.